Welcome to The Reel Rematch, the podcast where we unpack Hollywood's twin films, sometimes cloned on purpose, sometimes by accident, but always in competition. Today's matchup, Nuclear Nightmares, The Day After versus Threads, two devastating visions of nuclear apocalypse that shocked television audiences on opposite sides of the Atlantic, released less than a year apart. Which one left a deeper cultural scar? Which one portrayed the horror more convincingly? And which grim warning still haunts viewers decades later? All right, Jeff, we're here for a very somber and important, sort of our pod with the subject matter of the two films at hand, The Day After, which came out in 1983, and Threads, which came out in 1984, all about a, dramatisation, both of them almost done in a docudrama sort of style, about what would happen in the event of a nuclear war.
Mate, both of these films were, I know they were, they're 40, 50 years old almost now, but they were both incredibly powerful in the message they portrayed. They still resonate in today's, let's say, uncertain times. But given what they were just, very intense, very powerful films.
And so, can I just share? I mean, I don't think I've asked you. I don't know why. Maybe I was waiting for this pod. But do you remember seeing these films in primary school?
I don't, but that's not to say I didn't. So I guess maybe that slipped from my memory bank. Do you? Do you have a recollection of seeing this? Yeah. Yeah.
And I would have been obviously it wasn't when they were sort of released, it was a few years after. But I remember I was either year 6 or year 7, right? And West Australian school system at least, primary school goes to year 7. And I remember watching this and actually, other than just the harrowing nature of these films, being a little bit scarred from these for some time and just thinking there was a bit of a dark cloud over, humanity and the world and otherwise, and kind of been scared shitless, to be honest. I mean, seen as a young kid thinking, actually, these weapons exist, these tensions exist. If this ever happens, if anything, The Day After plays it down, Threads kind of gets it right, saying, the world is fucked if this ever happens. If the president of either the USA or at the time the USSR, if they ever press or authorize the pressing of the big red button, the world as we know it is done.
Absolutely. Yeah. And look, I may have seen it again, but I mean, your feeling back then is how I felt watching these films now. I felt, destroyed almost. Yeah. I felt scared. I'm just thinking, and again, maybe it's a difference now that being a parent as well. And you think to yourself, what would I do? What would I help my family do? What would any of that, would I be able to take care of if an event such as portrayed in either of these films happens? So,
and I mean, what a fascinating time in history that both of these films came out. And as a double English history major, my friend.
Yes.
I think this is your time to shine. Can you sort of really not just set the scene, but sort of take us through the meal in history that really was this point in time? What the hell was going on with the world that's sort of influencing sort of two of the bleakest, most intense, films that are, really neon flashing warning signs for everyone to calm the hell down and take a long walk and a soothing beverage.
Well, yes, I've done history of this time frame anyway prior, so I really enjoyed getting my teeth into the history of this one. So the early 80s, obviously the Cold War had been going on since the end of World War II, but obviously intensified going into the 60s and the 70s. But the 80s was a particular flashpoint. There was massive nuclear tensions going on, massive Cold War tensions going on between the East and the West. So they even called that at the time the Second Cold War, because it had always been there, but then it was peaking again, okay? So you've got things like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, which, again, a major downturn in East-West relations. You've got Reagan's presidency from 81 to 89. Obviously, he was a hardcore anti-Soviet person. He was aggressive in his anti-Soviet stance, and he escalated arms production, nuclear weaponry production, which obviously was then mirrored on the other side. You've got NATO then putting the nuclear deployments into Europe, which had not been done prior to Reagan's presidency. So they were putting the Pershing 2 missiles into Western Europe, which obviously the USSR then viewed as a first strike threat. They counteracted and did their own versions. So this was really a time on that side of the pond. And then you've got in Britain at the same time, you're talking, it was almost peak Thatcherism in the sense. Thatcher had been around since 1979. So she created a lot of political turmoil in the country with her stance on how things should be played out. You were going through massive strikes in the early 80s in the UK that was basically created an us versus them mentality. But again, being the relationship between the US and the UK, they were building in their strong relationships and again, anti-USSR sentiment. Then you've got things like in 1983, which was basically the scariest year of the Cold War, almost as bad as the 63 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Korean Airlines Flight 007 was shot down, accidentally entered our Soviet airspace and was shot down by the USSR, killed all 269 people, including a US congressman, which obviously inflamed tensions. Then you've got Able Archer at 1983, which was a massive NATO war simulation that at the time the Soviets mistook for an actual possible real first strike, to the point that they were prepared to counterattack and were literally at the point of someone putting their finger on the button. So we came incredibly close to World War in 1983, right?
Scary.
But because of that, obviously that feeling, and again, you've got what's going on in the UK versus what's going on in the US, that also created, the peace movement gained massive momentum because with that proliferation of nuclear weapons, people were protesting around the world to try and, get our leaders to stop this and wind everything back. New media and educational outreach were raising awareness of what the nuclear war would really look like. So, things, your scientists, your educators, your protesters, filmmakers, which is what we're here to talk about, collaborated to show there was no such thing as a winnable nuclear war, right? It was impossible to happen. So off the basis of that happening and the peace movement gaining momentum, then television, which was obviously more peak than being as we didn't have your cables and your streamings back then, it was like a mass mobilizer. So these two films we're going to talk about today, like The Day After and Threads, they were event television. Like they were watched by huge numbers of people, which we'll go into later. Like even The Day After came at a particularly heated point in time. And again, we'll talk about how Reagan actually noted it in his diary and how it, changed his thoughts about nuclear war, which is obviously incredibly important and led to a different political stance. So that time period when these came out, 83, 84, was literally, a real terrifying geopolitical standpoint around the world. Things had escalated. We were on the brink of war to the point that we may not be here having this conversation. But also because of that, the public had been awakened to the fact of what true nuclear carnage would look like, and that the media landscape was willing to visualize the unthinkable. So off the back of that, that led into more of these filmmakers going into these productions, and, Hollywood responded to these with their own films, as did British TV and some small British films, which then also off the back of that led into the post-apocalyptic films we've seen, your Mad Maxes of the world, things like that. So I think you were looking into like a list of these type of films, my friend, that were going on at the time?
Yeah, there was an explosion, right? I think you mentioned 1979, Russia's invasion of Afghanistan. That's kind of like where I think it really kind of like kicked off this like huge cycle of films about atomic bombs and nuclear warfare. The China Syndrome, 1979. Then let me just run through this. You've then pretty much got, Jeff, like another 18 films. So effectively over a decade, right, from 79 to 89, you're more or less having two of these type themed films a year. It's massive, right? So China Syndrome, 79. The Chain Reaction, 1980. Memoirs of a Survivor, 1981. The Atomic Cafe, 1982. Whoops Apocalypse, 1982. War Games with Matthew Broderick, of course, 1983. Testament, 1983. Special Bulletin, 1983, TV movie. Barefoot Jen, 1983. Silkwood, 1983. And you said 83 was the year, so there's literally something in the water, right? Art mirroring life and all the rest of it. Absolutely. The proof is here. Countdown to Looking Glass, 1984, which is a TV movie. It kind of like a simulated news broadcast tracking the outbreak of a nuclear war. And there's obviously elements of that in both Threads and The Day After.
Yes.
The War Game. Now, even though this was obviously hugely influential for both of these films, and it was actually produced back in 1965, it was banned for 2 decades, right? And this is a docudrama, like these next two, about nuclear war effects, but it was deemed, too incendiary and otherwise, pardon the really maybe ill-timed pun there, to release, because it would have scared the living suitcase out of the entire population, right? So it was actually broadcast for the first time in 1985 on PBS in the United States, and also in 1985 broadcast for the first time on BBC in the UK. Also in 1985, you've got DEFCON 4, which is a film. Then in 86, you've got The Manhattan Project and When the Wind Blows and Dead Man's Letters. Then in 87, you've got Ground Zero. And I also want to mention, because it's one of my favourite films of all time, you've got a board game called Nukem in RoboCop. That was the kind of like battleship style board game by Butler Brothers. And also, fun fact, in 1989, it appears in a frame. It's almost like it is an Easter egg in Back to the Future 2.
Yes.
They're playing it. So then in 1988, you've got Miracle Mile, and then in 1989, you've got Rules of Engagement. I mean, what a massive run for, atomic/nuclear themed, dealing with war and its effects run.
Yeah, but as you can, obviously, given that what was happening historically or politically at the time, the effect, and this has happened throughout history anyway, reflects what's happening in the world sometimes, filmmaking in particular, that these clearly are a shadow of the time and show exactly what was going on,
Yeah, I mean, again, I remember in the 80s, as a kid growing up, and, it started to disappear a little bit in, sort of like the 90s and otherwise. Maybe it's sort of like teen angst taking over and hormones and other things to me. But I remember there really was a bit of I wouldn't say palpable fear, right? But kind of like back in mind, like lurking in the shadows type fear.
Yeah.
That, we could all be gone in the blink of a, sort of click or blink of our eyes.
Yeah. Yeah. And we knew as well, I think, and actually I seem to remember, this is actually coming back to me as we talk about this. We knew at the time where we would be located should a nuclear bomb go off because of, at the time, we grew up in Australia. We both grew up in Perth, Western Australia, right? Yeah. It was a stop for US naval ships, still is, when they were travelling from the Middle East or other places. They would come through Perth for refuelling, resupplying, and the soldiers would get off. The economy loved it because US soldiers would spend a fortune.
Yeah.
Because of that, we're actually listed as because we are a US ally.
We're a target.
We were a target. So it was considered, okay, Perth's got to go. Do you know what I mean?
And it was interesting because as you know, so I was a little bit younger than you, and otherwise my mistaken, belief or misheld belief was, we're so far away from everything. No one's really going to give a rat's about us. We should be safe. And you know what? And if the bombs go off in the Northern Hemisphere, I know, sort of, trade winds and the rest, but, fallout shouldn't be that bad here, right?
Yeah. But again, I mean, we were way too young at that time.
Yeah.
When this, like we said, you remember seeing this, I potentially did see it, and even watching it now, just the fear that we would have felt at the time, particularly the unknown, because you're like, what are these people talking? What, really? That's going to happen? Like a bomb that just flattens everything straight away? Like, how do they do that? So, yeah, they're both incredibly powerful films. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, Threads is one of the most harrowing films I think I've ever seen in my life.
It is, yes, because it is just sheer. I think because that's not to say that The Day After isn't tough viewing, right?
Yeah.
But maybe it's that more slightly Hollywood feel it has to it, right?
Well, yeah, I mean...
And it had a far bigger budget.
And, and again, like, characters that are kind of, like a, warm glass of milk or, a blanket on a cold night sort of thing. I mean, a little bit more reassuring, but the starkness and I think then the flash forwards in time, a decade later, I'd Threads and like nothing's changed. The place is horrible. Like, the sort of, the soil's infertile and, there's an ever-present wind and, struggle to survive on its survival for what exactly, because there's, the absence of hope, really. I mean, it's intense.
Yeah.
Right. And not to say the Day After is not, but has a softer, sort of center.
Yes.
than Threads. Threads is certainly more like Margaret Thatcher's personality, very flinty, I guess, is maybe.
It's a very good point. It's a good way of putting it, actually. Very good way of putting it. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, a lot to take in with these two films. So
I mean, take us through the numbers best you can, because I appreciate both of these were TV films, but what have you got?
Well, I guess in terms of this, we're not going to talk box office like we normally do. We're going to talk figures. So The Day After was screened in November 28th, 1983, when it first came out. And Threads came pretty much a year later on September 23rd, 1984. So The Day After, I did have some budget numbers. So The Day After reportedly had a budget of about $7 million. And at the time, which was considered a bit of a lavish Hollywood production for a TV movie. Threads, I found some conflicting reports, anywhere from $250,000 to £700,000 as a budget. So I didn't quite get the full figure. I'm not sure if you had a number similar to that. But
yeah, like the number I had was £400,000 or 531,000 in change.
Yeah,
thousand, USD.
Yeah.
So yeah, pretty much the same.
A lot
in the middle of what you were saying.
Exactly. Now, The Day After is still considered the most watched TV movie in US history, right?
Can I unpack that a little bit further for you, G? So, because I got some stuff, unless you did, actually, on the audience and how historically it stands up.
Yeah.
So now I don't know what this means. I'm not a TV guy, but the film in the United States, when it was screened, earned a 46 rating.
Yep.
This corresponded to a 62% share of everyone who's watching TV at the time.
Yep.
Right? Now, at the time, its audience was only second to the 1983 finale of MASH, which drew roughly 106 million viewers, roughly 60% of households on CBS. Now, MASH currently sits at number 12 in the most watched US broadcast of all time. And strangely, The Day After, a lot of lists I was looking at wasn't actually listed, which I think is a huge oversight. These lists are dominated by Super Bowls.
Oh, right.
Right?
Okay.
It's pretty much Super Bowl, MASH, Super Bowl.
Okay.
Right? But what is incredible is that I don't know exactly where it fit because, in terms of the way they, level set the numbers or whatever they need to do. But on my estimation, it's anywhere between 13 and 16 of most watched US broadcasts in history.
Yeah.
But strangely, not a lot of majority, mainstream pop cultural lists. I mean, it should be, right? So I just wanted to share.
Oh, well, like you said, it's a 46. Like in my notes, I'd written at the time that was close to half of the US population.
Boom.
So you're talking, 200, 220, 240 million people, and 100 million of them watched this movie.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing.
It's phenomenal. In the UK, Threads at the time was seen by about 7 million people and was the most watched program that week. So still an effect. I think it has a cultural effect. Both of these films have cultural effects afterwards.
Actually, just on that, did you get in? I got a UK audience figure for the first screening of The Day After.
Oh, I didn't have that.
So apparently the first screening was the 10th of December, 1983 in the United Kingdom. And it was watched by either 15 or 16 million people.
There you go.
Which is massive because the population of the UK at the time was high 40s or 50?
Yeah, somewhere around that figure. Yes.
Right. I mean, so huge numbers. Not as huge as, the US, but, pretty good for an export.
Yeah, definitely. So obviously important pieces of television that were watched by a lot of people at the time.
Yeah.
Right. And again, which I think we'll touch on later, is that because of the nature of what these two films were talking about, in each country they had post-screening Q&As and film and conversation TV shows to explain to people, A, that was a work of fiction, and B, what the realities of that were, what was real within it, what would actually happen. All these things were to be discussed and were all taken as part of the television program. Yeah, it was almost like an event night beyond the film.
So Jeff, why don't we sort of pull on that thread a little bit, right? There was obviously a similar approach taken in the US to the UK. But why don't you talk, if you've got some research, talk about that. I've got some stuff myself, but what did you find?
I found that basically, the big one I pulled out was that Carl Sagan was involved in both of these, the famed scientist, right? And actually, the one thing we normally talk about, some famous quotes in these films. The quote I wanted to poke here was the one that Carl Sagan made when he was on US TV post this, which I think is incredibly important and how stupid this point was. So he quoted after sitting there, I mean, he was a consultant on Threads, but he was in this post-screening Q&A of the day after in the US.
Right.
He said, it's one of his most famous analogies about nuclear proliferation and how nuclear war was stupid. Imagine a room awash in gasoline, and there are two implacable enemies in that room. One of them has 9,000 matches, the other 7,000 matches. But each of them is concerned about who's ahead and who's stronger, right? It's like, who has the more matches? Not the fact that they're in a room full of gasoline, that who has the most matches, right? Just
so true.
Captures exactly what the feeling was. Like, as we said, this is a non-winnable war. The world loses should we get to this point.
I mean, just insanity, right? So let me sort of unpack a little bit more about how concerned, sort of like the networks were about, creating like mass hysteria and otherwise in the populace. So in the US, ABC, who screened the day after, produced it as well, didn't they, Jeff?
Yes, I believe they did.
They set up a special 1-800 hotline to calm people down during and after the original airing, right? They had a news program at the time called Viewpoint, and a special edition of this followed the airing of the movie. You've already mentioned, it had the scientist Carl Sagan, it had former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, author Elie Wiesel, former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, General Brent Scowcroft, and the commentator William F. Buckley Jr., right? And they were debating the merits of the film, right? Now, Dr. Carl Sagan, he obviously opposed the use of nuclear weapons, and conservative writer William F. Buckley supported the concept of nuclear deterrence, right? And during this discussion, which became quite heated, and it was obviously aired live, that's when Dr. Sagan introduced the concept of nuclear winter, right? Made the analogy that you mentioned. And again, I think nuclear winter, sort of touched on the day after, but essayed in threads. And I think that's the thing that probably scared me most, is that this stuff doesn't go away. Right? Now, in the UK, it was shown on ITV on Sunday, the 10th of December, 1983. I think we've mentioned that. They thought it was such an important film, they showed it without commercial breaks from 9:15 p.m. to 11:25 p.m. And then following the film came a debate program chaired by Robert Key and Jonathan Dimbley, right? So I think, what's really quite incredible about, the day after is that, the networks really took on some accountability and some responsibility for what they were showing. And they were really concerned about.
There was also ABC, Mr. Rogers, obviously one of America's most famous child entertainers. In the week before the show, they had segments in each of his daily thing programs for the children to understand the nature of, maybe not to the degree that this goes or what those post Q&As were, but just understanding the torment of nuclear threat. So in the week leading up to it, Mr. Rogers' Neighbourhood, they had conversations every day about aspects of this film that would affect small children.
I mean, it's just incredible, isn't it? Like, that the impact that this had around people thinking about, a post-nuclear existence, right? And really driving the disarmament and deterrence and really imbuing a whole generation, well, probably cross generations, that this wasn't just folly, this was insanity.
Yeah.
Right. And I just, again, I don't know, sort of, I think there's a little bit of research that we've both got sort of either way, and I'm glad that, the War Game was produced when it did, and 20 years later, they were able to sort of let it shine. But, its existence and obviously the viewing of it by these two filmmakers or the producing crews or the studio executives, or a combination of all behind that, getting to see that and saying, hey, we're going to do a contemporary reimagining of this. In all fairness, like, it's like humanity's better for it. Like, I mean, it's amazing. And I hope that for people who haven't seen these films, fine, they've dated and otherwise, but you'll never get a better, message movie that is, just telling everyone just to kind of like calm down and kind of like, think it through without, preaching to anyone and otherwise. It's just kind of giving you the stark reality of, hey, if we take it too far, this is how it plays out.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Exactly right.
And yeah, I think what an amazing, impact it's had over the decades.
Well, like you said, it's about the head of these TV networks getting these creative people doing this. So in terms of, we talk about our twin films and how these things come about and do they compete with each other in those kind of scenarios. What was interesting, and I'm sure you found the same thing when we did this, was that to me, I found that according to history, it was the head of the ABC in the US who had seen the China Syndrome,
right, and
off the back of that decided to commission a TV movie about the aftermath of nuclear war in the US. Right. On the other side of the channel, it was the head of the BBC, the Director General of the BBC had seen the film War Game, the one we spoke about from 1966, right, which was at the time, it was thought to be too controversial for the time.
Right.
It was actually not screened for those 20 plus years, like you said, because the BBC actually thought that people would start killing themselves if it was actually broadcast back in the late 60s.
And, I mean, I can't remember, this is a question without notice, but, Orson Welles did that famously infamous reading of War of the Worlds.
Yes.
Just on radio, or the wireless, maybe back in the day as it was referred to.
Caused mass panic.
And, mass hysteria, right?
Yeah.
Like, people were like, oh, aliens are invading. Like, let's get on with things,
because
right?
Because you did it in that news fashion, docudrama way.
Yeah. Scared
the living crap out of the entire population.
I mean, I can't even remember when that was.
Right. Late 30s, early 40s.
Right, yeah. Maybe one.
Let's put that as a note we both need to look up.
Yeah, we need to circle back to that.
But that was, so he'd seen that, the Director General, and from that he said, we want to commission a TV film to be made. So it's interesting that, again, we're going back to that whole point that two people have been taken to this mindset based on something they've witnessed that they then want to go and get out into the world. Right? Like you said, it's made it a better place because of it.
So because we're talking about like TV studio executives and otherwise, and, people, inserting themselves, from their personal perspective and political perspective and otherwise about the use of nuclear weapons. So for Threads, in the US, Ted Turner, who was obviously TV magnate, certainly at the time, he wanted to air this film on TBS, or Turner Broadcasting, which is his cable TV network, but he couldn't find a sponsor. So he literally just reached into his own pocket and funded it himself.
Yep.
I mean, that's how passionate he was. And I think this is again, how impactful these films were, and the decisions that, these, highfalutin sort of creative types, that they were literally putting their money where their mouth was.
Yeah.
I just did a quick search, Jeff, and Orson Welles directed and narrated the infamous War of the Worlds radio broadcast on October 30, 1938.
There you go. Okay. Just before World War II literally broke out. So,
right.
Yeah. But, there's so much to talk about these two films. So, I think, it was interesting in seeing, going back to where we're talking about, where they, the twin film parallel that we've seen here, that they both started at the same time and they both were created in the same manner, right? But then, all right, what about the guys who made them? Should we talk about the directors who made them then?
Yeah. I mean, I've got a bit like I usually do. Do you want me to jump into that?
Go for it.
So I'll start with The Day After.
Sure.
So Nicholas Meyer, he was coming off Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, in 1982, by, Star Trek aficionados and others. Many people do still to this day refer to that as the best Star Trek film, right? I mean, I love Star Trek, but I'm not a hardcore sort of Trekker and otherwise.
Yeah. For
what it's worth, it's probably my favourite Star Trek film. But I mean, wow, what a huge film for him to come off. Now, he does this film in 83, and after this, he does a couple of things. He does Company Business in 91 with Gene Hackman and Mikhail Baryshnikov, Kurtwood Smith and Terry O'Quinn, all in that. Great cast. But that film didn't click with audiences upon its release. But he also knocks out, same year, Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, right?
Yep.
So he did $75 million at the US box office and $97 million worldwide. And that was actually his last outing as a director, when he then just focused on writing for the balance of his career.
Well, I noted him as he almost had a stronger career as a writer more well known as a writer than a film director. I mean, obviously directing these, but, he wrote the film time after time from his own novel. He's also a novelist. He was uncredited for rewrites on Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan. He wrote Star Trek IV. He did uncredited rewrites for Adrian Lyne on Fatal Attraction.
Yeah, right.
He wrote Star Trek VI, Human Stain, and he also wrote the animated Prince of Egypt film. So he's pretty widespread there. But
pretty prolific.
Yeah, I mean, had a bit more of that. But just to go back there for a minute, he actually said he was never going to direct TV. It was one of his things, he was never going to do it. But after reading the script for The Day After, he said this was too good not to do it because of the message that it told.
Yeah, so true.
Yeah.
So going over to Threads, directed by Mick Jackson. He had been directing TV since 1973. And after this, he works on 3 TV series in the UK. Then he directs Chattahoochee in 1989 with Gary Oldman, Dennis Hopper, Francis McDormand, Ned Beatty, and Emmett Walsh. What a cast.
Yeah, that's a big cast.
He does LA Story in 91 with Steve Martin, Victoria Tennant, Richard E. Grant, and Sarah Jessica Parker. I love that movie.
Yeah, it's a good one.
And then he does the global blockbuster, The Bodyguard. in 1992 with Kevin Costner and Whitney Houston. He does a few things after that, and then he does Volcano in 97 with Tommy Lee Jones and Anne Hesh. Continues to work solidly through to 2016, but nothing of real note, right? Interestingly, Mick Jackson was hired to direct Threads because he'd previously worked in the area of nuclear apocalypse in 1982, producing A Guide to Armageddon, which I've just realised is not on my list.
Oh, but I read that was just like a half hour.
Is that what it was?
Yeah, because he was directing the documentary series, that QED documentary series.
Right.
So that was one of the episodes of the documentary series. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's probably why it wasn't on.
Probably didn't come up on your list of films.
Okay, so episode.
It's interesting with him, though, isn't it, that he goes from this incredibly, powerful anti-nuclear film and then goes over to America. And not that I'm denigrating anything he's done, but all his films beyond that seem to just become a bit more lighthearted. And
he goes Hollywood, right?
Yeah, he definitely goes Hollywood.
I mean, from a solid, working TV director of some, pretty interesting shows in the UK. The amazingly important film that he did with Threads, and then not to say that he chases paychecks and otherwise, but certainly goes a lot more mainstream and a lot more sort of like soft entertainment than anything else. I mean, there's no other message story really in anything else. There's obviously comments on society, especially in LA Story and The Bodyguard, but they're all pretty light.
Yeah.
But I did realize though that on this one he took this work really, really seriously. He really went to work on this. Apparently, in preparation for the film, he traveled around the UK and the US, and he was consulting scientists, psychologists, doctors, defense specialists, and strategic experts in order to create the most realistic depiction of nuclear war possible, right, for this film. He was actually inspired by a 1983 Science article, Nuclear Winter, Global Consequences of Multiple Nuclear Explosions, that was actually penned by your boy, Carl Sagan and James Pollack. So details of a possible attack scenario and the extent of the damage were derived from Doomsday, a nuclear attack on the United Kingdom, which came out in 83, while the ineffective post-war plans of the UK government was influenced by Duncan Campbell's 1982 expose War Plan UK. In portraying the psychological damage suffered by survivors, I should say, Jackson took inspiration from the behaviour of Hibakusha and Magnus Clark's 1982 book, Nuclear Destruction of Britain. So, I mean, again, he was really drawing far and wide and went really quite deep, really taking on a project of this gravity. He left no stone unturned to ensure that he was really influencing this with, leading thought thinkers, and in this space and, what they had been hypothesizing and otherwise. So, yeah, I mean, I think, respect to Mick Jackson for taking the time.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And him and Barry Hines, the writer, as well as all of that, I read, spent a week with the UK's parliamentary they had like a department whose job was post-disaster management. And they spent a week with them picking their brains, again, similar to what you said, but things like, what would happen from societal changes to chemical changes to infrastructure changes to industrial changes, all that stuff. Like you said, kudos to them because they took everything that could and would happen and put it into this film, right?
Yeah.
To depict the realism of what was going to happen.
I think that the fact-based stuff that came out of Threads was second to none, I think, in research for a TV film, that ostensibly initially is meant to meant to entertain, but I think this one was really more a public service warning.
Yes.
About, if we kind of, don't start making noises and start thinking clearly and rationally now, watch out. But, further to your point, if you rewind back to 1980, there are actually findings from this British government exercise that was called Square Leg. And they were actually used as the basis for projecting the level of destruction and the number of casualties in the movie, right? So Square Leg was a government project, it was like a war game. Yeah. Right? They pretty much estimated what would happen in Britain in the event of an actual attack. It projected the mortality rate at 29 million, serious injuries at 7 million, and short-term survivors at 19.
Yes, there you go. So you're talking reducing the population by more than half from nuclear bombs going off in the UK.
So, again, sort of like the work was done by, led by Mick Jackson. No doubt he had, sort of like a team of, assistants and supporters and otherwise helping on that. But, as I said, that's just massive respect that they go into, that level of detail and, treat the material as seriously as it needs to be treated, right?
Yeah. So, but similarly in the US, they did some similarities. So Edward Hume, who was brought on to write the film, he did the same thing. He actually went and researched with some government departments, reviewed post-apocalypse outcomes and scenarios. And at the time, even when they first started pitching this, it was always going to be pitched in Kansas, right? So it was always going to be based in Kansas. But after doing their research, that's why they moved it to the town of Lawrence, because they knew if they did it right in the heart of Kansas, Kansas was considered a nuclear target given the silo activity around it.
Yeah.
That Kansas would just be wiped off the map, and they could not. But Lawrence was enough of a distance away that there would be survivors to give us these representations that we saw on the film.
Oh, fascinating.
So that's why they moved it there. Plus, as well, I think the people of the town of Lawrence, where they shot it, they were more than happy to have the filmmakers there. I think Kansas kind of wasn't as happy when they knew they were going to be literally obliterated.
So let me segue there if you don't mind. So there were over 2,000 Lawrence residents, including many University of Kansas students, being used as extras. They'll pay like $50 to shave their heads bald and act as if they were dying of radiation sickness. They were asked not to bathe during the aftermath scenes to add authenticity to the movie. So I thought, that was fascinating. But I mean, obviously it would have been, to your point, it would have been the biggest game in town for Lawrence and would have had quite a huge, sugar hit positive impact to their economy.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And even casting-wise, so although Meyer was coming off Star Trek 2, he actually, the ABC wanted to fill this full of names, right? And although some of the actors in this film we now know more well, at the time, the biggest name on the film was Jason Robards, who plays the lead doctor, right? Everyone else was they were small bit players. Steve Guttenberg, John Lithgow, Amy Madigan, Jo Beth Williams. She was second tier because she was the second best known, but the rest, because they're all littered through the cast listing, they weren't the famous actors that we now know them to be back in the day. But everything else was all locals.
So do you mind if I break down the casting as I usually do and
of course.
Where they were in their careers? So,
absolutely.
Our boy, Jason Robards, best known for his roles as Ben Bradley in All the President's Men, which came out in 1976. He obviously won the Best Supporting Oscar and then followed it next year as Dashiell Hammett in Julia, 1977, starring Jane Fonda, where he also won Best Supporting Actor. Back-to-back supporting actors.
That's impressive.
I mean, wow, right? He's also known for his role as Cheyenne in James Coburn's Nemesis in one of my favourites, Once Upon a Time in the West in 1968. And he was Steve Martin's father in Parenthood in 1989.
Yes.
Towards the end of his career, he had a small but memorable role as Congressman Philip Hammersley in Tony Scott's Enemy of the State. So he's the one who gets the syringe and then he's put into the Mercedes that's then pushed into the lake.
Wow, that is a small but memorable role.
Yeah. 100%. It's not like...
It's like that for 10 seconds.
It's because of All the President's Men and because of Once Upon a Time in the West. Like, I love this guy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So every time he hops up, he's one of those guys I'm just really happy to see.
Yeah.
And he also had a prominent role as Julianne Moore's father in Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia in 1999. So just a bit of a quick flyover of his career, and not just specifically the befores and afters. Now let's go to Jo Beth Williams. This is kind of like peak Williams, right? She does Poltergeist in 1982. One of my all-time favourites. She does The Big Chill in 1983, which, probably did for baby boomers what, Breakfast Club did for Gen X, I guess.
Yep.
She does a TV movie before this and has a minor hit with Teachers in 1984 with Nick Nolte. She works consistently throughout her career, but not in anything that really captures the same attention as any of those roles in the films that I've just mentioned.
Yep.
Now, talking about up-and-comers, you had a young Steve Guttenberg. Now, he did The Boys from Brazil in 1978 with Gregory Peck, Laurence Olivier, and James Mason. One of those things is not like the other, Jeff. He did the TV movie Miracle on Ice, which was based on the true story about the US Olympic hockey team beating the Soviets at the 1980 Winter Olympics. He starred in Barry Levinson's Diner in 1982. He did this in 83, and then Police Academy in 1984. He does Cocoon and Police Academy 2 in 1985, Short Circuit and Police Academy 3 in 86, and then one of the weirdest movies of all time, 3 Men and a Baby, we're three guys in their late 30s or early 40s, like are living with each other. and then someone drops off a kid.
Yep.
Anywho, he also does Police Academy 4 in 1987.
There you go.
Now, it's interesting. I think John Lithgow had a slightly larger profile than maybe he sold it. I'm happy to agree to disagree and otherwise, but just think about this. He was coming off one of my favourite films, Brian De Palma's Blowout in 1981.
Yep.
He does The World According to Garp with Robin Williams in 82.
Oh, yes, of course.
He was then in, great Australian director George Miller's segment Nightmare at 20,000 Feet in The Twilight Zone, the movie, which was released the same year as The Day After. And then he does Terms of Endearment and follows that up with Footloose in 84.
As the preacher.
So maybe this is when he's starting to crest into public consciousness and starts to become John Lithgow.
Yes.
Right? But, that being said, what an incredible cast for a TV movie. And not trying to downplay, but like back in the early 80s where TV was seen as the poorer cousin or otherwise.
Absolutely.
To film, that's actually quite a magnificent cast.
Yeah,
it's huge.
It definitely is. Yes, so absolutely.
I'll jump over to Threads.
Yep.
This is going to be quick. No notable cast, right?
Yes.
Now, there were actors who had solid careers, right? And some of them have still got, they're still working today, right? Predominantly in TV series or TV movies. But it was the TV acting debut of Jane Hazelgrove. So that was kind of like a fun fact. So I don't have anything else about the cast of Threads.
The only thing I have about the cast of Threads is that at the time, Jackson was going to try and cast actors from Coronation Street, which is like the big UK soap that's been going for forever.
It's like they're like Neighbours or Home and Away.
Now, just a fun fact, basically half of these people have now either been on or are still on Coronation Street.
That's hilarious.
So there you go. So
Mick Jackson saw the future.
There you go. He saw the future and he called them actors on Threads. But yeah, so that was just an interesting little tidbit that I found going through some research on this one. So
fascinating.
Yeah.
So now let's talk. We'd like to use this next section for the Aussie connection to this film.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a couple of good ones.
Alrighty.
Right.
I'm sure I might have some of the same.
So, Threads.
Yes.
I'll start with 1984.
Mm-hmm.
You've got this one, I'm assuming. So it was not solely a BBC UK production. It was internationally co-produced by the BBC, the Nine Network in Australia, and Western World Television Incorporated, right? Now, Threads aired in Australia on the Nine Network on the 19th of June 1985, and not dissimilar to screenings of the films in different places in the world, it was unique for a commercial broadcaster as it was played without commercial breaks.
There you go.
Again, just reflecting the film's gravity. We're not here to sell, sodas or, bikes or, razors or otherwise.
Yep.
Let's give this our full and undivided attention. Apparently, Threads was also meant to take place in Australia.
Yes, so at the beginning of pre-production, they were planning to shoot it here.
Yeah, but then the producers decided to film it in the UK.
Yep.
And you know what? That makes me a lot happier and full respect to the people from Sheffield that it's happening in Sheffield versus, some regional town in Australia, which I think would have scared me even more than this film already scared me.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with what you just said. Yes.
And in terms of The Day After, right, no real Aussie connection, like in and of itself in terms of the production or involvement or otherwise. But there's, as you know, the Australian investigative journalism program, Four Corners, aired a documentary focusing on The Day After. It was reported on by Jeff McMullen and examined the film's impact, particularly in Lawrence, Kansas, where it was shot and its resonance with Australian audiences.
Okay.
So, again, not, more sort of a tangential connection, but some tenuous one nevertheless.
Yeah, there's always, you know what? Because us Australians are ubiquitous, we're everywhere.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, should we get into some fun facts? I mean, as much as you can have a fun fact.
Well, yeah, I don't think this is a fun, this one, we can deem them as fun facts or trivia as well. I mean, we didn't really talk critical reviews like we normally do because there's not a lot out there, but I can tell you that The Day After does have an 86% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, but only from 14 reviews from critics.
Right.
Red sits at 100%. It's one of the only 100% films sitting on Rotten Tomatoes. Again, from only 14 reviews. That's probably the most I really need to see in this. Yeah, but fun facts. So Threads chose Sheffield as a location. So we spoke about why they chose Lawrence because of the relative distance from Kansas. They chose Sheffield because it actually had, at the time, it had a nuclear-free policy. And so they were actually very sympathetic to the production because of its anti-nuclear stance.
Right.
They also did that because part of their very thorough research, as you mentioned, was that if a nuclear bomb was launched in the UK, they would aim for an industrial town, which is what Sheffield was.
Right.
So, but the other thing was Mick Jackson never gave the council of Sheffield the entire script, so they didn't know exactly the entirety of the film as they shot it.
Smart.
So, because he realised that might change their perspective on things a little bit.
Yeah.
So,
Well, a magician doesn't reveal as they perform the trick,
exactly
right.
Exactly right. So the big one I wanted to mention, there's a couple I wanted to mention. The big one is The Day After.
Yeah.
Okay. So this film can be considered the winner of the first ever viral marketing campaign. All right.
Oh,
so
break it down.
when it first was ready to be released, so both of these films went through a bit of a turbulent production, purely not from what happened on set day to day, but purely because the networks were trying to tone down some of the imagery, tone down some of the messaging a little bit, right? Nicholas Meyer actually walked off editing the film for a while the day after because they were trying to get him to turn it into, as he said, a typical US disaster film, you know? And it was only when they tried to re-edit it so he left and the editor was only when they tried to re-edit it, they couldn't make it work, that they got him back in to fix it and said, okay, it's yours to do as you do.
Right. Good.
But what he did is Meyer then slipped a bootleg copy of the film to two anti-nuclear activists who were called Josh Barron and Mark Graham, well known at the time. They subsequently made copies of it and took it to various peace groups. They interviewed peace leaders about the film. They held screenings in homes, in bars, in restaurants, in clubs, in community centres. They had post-screening discussion groups. They had town hall meetings. They held private screenings for the media like Time Magazine, the New York Times, even the BBC, who was going through threads at the time. Higher-ups wanted to see the film. In the UK, the House of Commons wanted to see it. Apparently the Pope wanted to see it.
Wow.
So they actually called it, rather than viral marketing, because that wasn't a term back in the day, they actually called it the hijack ABC's marketing of the film. So, and Variety at the time called it the greatest PR campaign in history. Right. Now, this created massive talk and massive groundswell behind the film. And actually, this is before it was even broadcast, and actually made it difficult for ABC executives who, at the time, were trying to kill it. Because before he'd seen it, Reagan and his government had tried to squash the film. Didn't want it broadcast. So, yeah, essentially this groundswell of public sentiment about the film is what got it broadcast to the numbers that it did.
Just incredible.
There's a lot more. Do you want me to finish my day after notes? I've got
go. No, keep going.
The title of the film came from the executive VP of TV movies at ABC. His name was Stu Stoddard, because he wanted everyone to know the movie was about the aftermath of the nuclear attack, and it wasn't a disaster film. Nicholas Meyer actually wanted to give the original title, which was called Silence in Heaven, but he was overruled by the executives to The Day After.
And you know what? That's a solid win and a rightful win for the executives, because The Day After is a much better title. Yeah.
Meyer says that when he was working with the actors, they were heavily impacted by the script and were so deeply affected after they saw the mushroom cloud effect over Kansas that they all started having nightmares. Apparently everyone on set did. They actually nicknamed them nuke-mares, because everyone was having actual physical nightmares about this. Now, speaking of the mushroom clouds. So the mushroom clouds were made by one of the producers of the film who coordinated the visual effects. Her name was Stephanie Austin. So they came up with a solution. They couldn't quite work out how to make this effect. We're talking 1983 prior to CGI effects. So their ingenious solution was they took a dollop of cream was filmed as it fell from a spoon into a tank of water. They flipped it over upside down and it looked remarkably like the aftermath of a nuclear explosion. Okay?
Genius.
Yes. Now, and this is where you'll like this fact.
Yeah.
At the end of the 1980s, Stephanie Austin moved to a little production company called Coralco. You may have heard of them a couple of times.
Of course. Love those guys.
Yes, where James Cameron was working on what he was initially conceived as a low-budget sequel to 1984's The Terminator, so Terminator 2 Judgment Day. He was so impressed by her work on The Day After, he hired her as a co-producer on what would become Terminator 2 Judgment Day. But at the time, it was a lot low budget than what it eventually did, because obviously it was the first $100 million film production.
Isn't that incredible?
Yeah.
Sort of like, what an amazing... Again, just talks to the influence of this film in sort of like many different ways.
Yes. Now, my last fact I can give you about this. Nicholas Meyer was awarded the Future of Life Award in 2023 for reducing the risk of nuclear war through storytelling.
And richly deserved. Well done.
And he always said, I don't know if it was an interview at the time, whatever, and acknowledged, he said it at the time, my private grandiose notion was that this movie would unseat Ronald Reagan when he ran for re-election. So although he wasn't trying to stop him, he just didn't like Reagan as a politician.
Right.
So
interesting.
Yeah.
So look, I've only got a couple of things to kind of like, sprinkle in at the end here. Very comprehensive coverage by you, so thank you for that. So I do have a note, and maybe I should have mentioned it before, but apparently no sponsors bought commercial time after the nuclear war broke out.
Yes, I did have that.
So the last half was aired without commercials.
Yes.
And again, like that's fine. I mean, I think, no one's going to want to think about, cornflakes or, breakfast products or whatever after you see, the best part of, sort of the population of the US just get eviscerated.
Yes. But again, unprecedented in the day because of the nature of what commercial television was.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, exactly, right? This is the kind of the start in good faith of the MTV era, right? It was all about the TV. It was all about, consumerism. It was, so I mean, like, what an incredible choice.
Yeah.
And I've got two other kind of like things. Well, two, it's kind of like broken into two parts. So during the movie, as Steve Guttenberg's character, Stephen Klein, as he hitchhikes home to Joplin, he's referring to Joplin, Missouri, right? Now, apparently, this is the birthplace of Bombardier Kermit Behan, pilot of the B-29 Superfortress boxcar, which dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki, Japan.
Wow.
So how's that for a little Easter egg?
That's an Easter egg and a half.
Now, the 1 in 2 parts is actually about the US Department of Defense. Apparently, they would only cooperate with the film's production on the condition that it was made very clear in the story that the Soviets and not the US launched their missiles first. But
that never happens.
I mean, like, you know what, like, that's actually the last thing that I'm paying attention to, right? Because, I mean, like, it's really like the Jason Robards character, right? And, what he's personally going through. And they set him up so well at the start, like seeing his daughter watch his son playing gridiron or football, I guess, as the Americans would call it, right?
Yeah.
It was, like that was kind of really where my eyes went. And then also the family that Jo Beth Williams is a part of as well. Like that's really like the emotional center and core of the film. So
yeah.
I didn't even focus on, did Guido shoot first type of scenario. That wasn't a thing for me watching this film.
I remember thinking about this as like who did shoot first. There was no Guido Han Solo in this film. It was
just on.
Tensions happened.
Yeah.
Bomb started.
So the only other thing that I got, again, the second part to the Department of Defense, is that the producers of this film, they were able to actually get stock footage of the Minutemen III intercontinental ballistic missile test launches, but the Department of Defense wouldn't allow them to use the mushroom clouds. So then your girl, Stephanie, was able to use her brilliance and create that amazing effect.
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
So trivia on Threads.
So the scene with the cat going through the aftermath of the nuclear blast and rolling around was actually footage of a cat that was given a big, solid, good dose of catnip and filmed in reverse to give the effect of pain and agony for the cat surviving going through the nuclear blast.
Like, was Peter around then, or it was like Peter on set?
I don't remember seeing a animals were harmed thing at the end of this film.
Exactly. I think things would be different now, right? I don't think
just a little bit.
You get away with that anymore.
Just a little bit. So, because again, we're in the UK where we don't have a heck of a lot of budget, the makeup for the extras was third-degree burns was done using Rice Krispies and tomato sauce.
Wow.
Which is just... Again, how we used to make films when we were 12 years old and didn't know what to do to make special effects, right?
Yeah.
Which is quite funny. I thought that's a little bit. Now, Mick Jackson himself says that he actually considered abandoning his work on Threads when he heard there was another nuclear bomb filming. This is off the special edition commentary on the DVD. And that was the day after, right? But then he saw the day after and thought it did not capture the nuclear war well, so he went ahead with Threads. He then further criticised it, particularly for the crane shot where they come out of the gym and there's all those hundreds of thousands of people inside the gym.
Right.
That he criticised that, saying it's like a shot in Gone with the Wind. I thought, this is obscene. You shouldn't be making homages in a subject like this. This is why I decided to go ahead and make Threads. I was so angry at this blown opportunity. So
And you know what? I mean, like, I'm great. He had that, sort of grateful, I should say, that he had that strong sense of justice or injustice, that the material hadn't been handled appropriately. Because, I mean, his film is affecting in a way that The Day After, wasn't. I mean, appreciate that, the Day After came first, and it had a huge, sort of audience in the US. But I think over time, just purely as a standalone film, I think Threads is the better film.
Now, from a technical perspective, the reason Ruth, the young girl, never gets sick in the film is because radiation attacks the unborn baby cells before affecting the mother. So, which they say would explain why the daughter was deformed and technically mute and stuff like that, because the mother is providing all the nutrients to the baby through the umbilical cord. So any radiation, she was actually...
Oh, it kind of gets filtered.
Basically, yes.
Right.
So that's actually from a study done in 1988.
That's kind of messed up.
And I'll leave you with this is my last one I have on Threads. So the most famous image from Threads, the front cover and everything else, is the traffic warden with the bandage face and his one eye only showing, right, wearing his hat and his traffic warden uniform.
Yep.
Okay? It's a famous costume for Halloween in the UK. Sells out. He's got his own action figure, but the character only appears in the film for no more than 30 seconds. It's basically a passing shot of him. That's it. But somehow they took a photo of him that became the image for the film.
Isn't that incredible what captures the public imagination?
Yeah. So it was on the front cover of the DVD, the VHS. It was on the cover of the Radio Times in the UK, which is the big TV magazine during the big thing like TV guides that we had. That was the Radio Times was the TV guide in the UK. But no one knew who he was. So it wasn't until 2024 that BBC Radio Sheffield tracked him down.
Oh, really?
So his name was Michael Beecroft. He was 44 years old at the time the film was made.
Right.
He was an actual traffic warden.
Right.
In Sheffield. So he just showed up in his uniform one day to say, I'm here. And then they said, okay, cool. And that's what they dressed him and costumed him at. He took the role for a bit of extra money. Right. That was it, because he just came in. Again, it's typical Lawrence. They just had calls for local people from Sheffield. And when he was interviewed in 2024, he was gobsmacked and totally amazed by the popular reaction to this tiny, tiny role that he took. So
isn't that incredible? And then sort of maybe the sort of like the cash registers started clicking in your brain thinking, hey, I can sue for unlicensed use of my person.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I've only got a couple of things to add, Jeff. So actually, I should have brought this up earlier when we're talking about, again, just the weight and the gravity that this film had and how it was treated by the sort of like the TV executives and otherwise. So upon the US debut of Threads on Superstation TBS on January 13, 1985, there was actually an intro by Ted Turner himself, the guy.
Okay.
Right, and this was followed, not dissimilar to The Day After, with a panel discussion on nuclear war. And apparently, and I don't know the difference between like, basic or otherwise. Maybe they're talking about sport or something. I'm not too sure. But apparently Threads became the most watched basic cable program in US history at that time.
Wow.
No specific viewer figures or otherwise. Now, it was also, Threads had a repeated viewing on BBC One on the 1st of August 1985 as part of a week of programs marking the 40th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it also saw that same, I don't know if it was the same day, but it was certainly the same week, the first television screening of the war game.
Yeah, okay.
And then Threads screened again on BBC 4 on the 9th of October 2024 at 10:20 p.m. to belatedly mark its 40th anniversary. This was only the fourth time it was screened on British TV.
Yes, and one other fact I did see is that the producers of Adolescence, the famous Netflix single take story at the moment, are now talking about making a reimagining TV series of Threads. So
just incredible. So, I mean, pretty heavy subject matter, Jeff, and I certainly wanted to, just sort of cuddle up with my, sort of little cavoodle and, sort of, hug my kids, kiss my wife, and maybe go stroll through a field of tulips and stuff afterwards just to feel better. But just goes to show just, the impact and that moment in time, that these films have and how they still echo and resonate today. And the world's a better place for both of these films being produced.
I agree. And I think because the effect they had not only on the population, the people who watched them, but what we didn't mention is that Ronald Reagan actually noted in his diary after watching these how much The Day After affected him.
Yeah.
Now, although talks have been going on for a little bit, it wasn't shortly after this that nuclear disarmament talks began and the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty started to become something real. So the legacy and impact of these films is quite amazing.
Actually, the last tidbit, maybe we'll end the sort of like the pod shortly thereafter, by way of trivia, is that apparently, so this isn't fully vetted or otherwise, but apparently after the broadcast of Threads on BBC, Ronald Reagan made a speech that was less aggressive than expected. And there was a cartoon on the front of the London Times on the 25th of September 1984 depicting one person reading a headline, right, saying Reagan's peace speech, and another asking, do you think he saw Threads?
Yes, I think that's a good place to end.
So Jeff, we've been in the dark. Do we have any light to look forward to next episode?
Not, my friend. We've done what happens during the apocalypse. We're going to next time talk about what happens after the apocalypse. So we're going to look at two films that are post-apocalyptic, came out at the same time. We're going to look at The Road and The Book of Eli.
Another light watching to prepare, Jeff. So
I think you need to go home, have a good lie down, maybe rest up, cuddle your cavoodle, and I'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Thanks, mate.